but please, people, do see if you can see me, because even if just for 1 minute, I just want to hold up my very own copy of Fiona's book, which focuses. One of the people in the book is obviously Susanna Klein, who Fiona's going to talk to us about today, and most of us know Fiona very well, but just in case you don't, or just in case you forgot anything, let me just say that Fiona Leach, who is presenting a paper for us this evening, is Professor Emerita of International Education at the University of Sussex. She has published wildly and widely in the field of gender and education, with particular focus on gender violence in schools in Africa and Asia. In more recent years, she has turned to historical research and has published articles on missionary women and girls' schooling in early 19th century West Africa in the journals of Gender and Education and History of Education. Her book, Reclaiming the Women of Britain's First Mission to West Africa, 3 Lives Lost and Found, was published in 2018 by Brill, and her talk today is based on a paper in Women's History Review, which is available online. And Fiona has very kindly offered that if anybody would like to download a copy of that paper, I will put a link after the talk and during the questions in the chat box, so you can access it, because she says she has 50 that she's, is that correct, Fiona?
Yes, I've used a couple, but no, anybody who wants it, I think they just click on the link.
That's it.
I've sent 2 copies to people who weren't able to join today.
That's great. Good.
Okay, right.
Excellent.
Okay, so without further ado, Fiona, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you. I'll aim, I think, to finish by 6:20, let's say, hopefully.
As you do, as you do.
As you do, yes. Right, welcome everybody. The paper on which my talk is based was inspired by the notorious alternative facts assertion made in 2016 by Donald Trump's advisor, Kellyanne Conway, that the crowds at his presidential inauguration were bigger than those of his predecessors. Her statement met with worldwide derision, but it got me thinking about alternative facts, how they are created and how they come to be accepted by so many as the truth when clear evidence reveals otherwise, such as photographic in the case of Trump's inauguration. And in the case of the 2020 US election, over 60 court rulings that the elections were not fraudulent. More recently, of course, we have conspiracy theories around COVID-19 and vaccines. Such alternative versions of reality are repeated and amplified through the echo chamber that is social media, but there's nothing new about alternative facts. When I started my historical research, from what Joe's told you, I'm not actually a trained historian. So when I started it, I had the overwhelming impression that the early Protestant missions were all male affairs. And it was a while before I discovered the truth, which I discovered actually in a footnote in a history of the CMS. So it's a valid question to ask, how was this myth created and sustained by mission historiography for 2 centuries, almost right up to the present day? It's true that the meta-narrative of the all-male missionary enterprise has been determinedly chipped away. So I'm going to not make you look at the same slide all the time. It's true that the meta-narrative of the all-male missionary enterprise has been determinedly chipped away at by feminist scholars over the past few decades, who have revealed the important roles played by women in the evangelizing effort, both at home and overseas. Yet the early years of overseas missions remain largely untouched. This is perhaps understandable given the scarcity and fragmentation of surviving records, and therefore of the digitized equivalents, and the inordinate effort required to track down the ephemeral presence of most women. So in reflecting on the phenomenon of alternative facts in history, I realized I had an excellent illustration in my own research of the mechanism whereby the meta-narrative of the omnipresent lone male in the early overseas missionary movement was sustained, despite clear evidence not only of the presence of a large number of women, but also of female agency, including direct intervention in mission affairs, considered at the time to be the exclusive preserve of men. My illustration is provided by one of the first wives to serve on the Church Missionary Society's West African mission, which was founded in Sierra Leone in 1804. This was Susanna Klein, an unusually outspoken missionary wife who rocked the CMS establishment with her claims of missionary misdemeanours, but who has disappeared almost entirely from accounts of this early period. What I found shocking was firstly the ease with which her intervention was suppressed by the CMS, and secondly, the fact that historians, even some quite recently, have continued to misrepresent this episode of CMS history, thus sustaining, consciously or not, the all-male story. The uncritical use and disregard of primary source material and the subsequent equally uncritical reproduction of this material is very much to blame, as it is in the contemporary context of fake news. In unpicking the story of how Susanna was written out of CMS history, we should start by examining the relevant primary sources and the context surrounding them. Predictably, the correspondence between home and overseas, minutes of meetings, and missionary reports and journals were all the work of men. Women who served on the mission rarely wrote to the secretary until single women began to be recruited in the mid-1840s and given charge of girls' schools. As women's letter writing was mostly addressed to family and friends back in Europe, very little of it has survived, at least not in the public domain. It was this privileging of the public over the private in the recording and preserving of knowledge that made of the mission a male construct. There were, in fact, 80% of the CMS missionaries who served in West Africa during the mission's first 2 decades were actually married. There were a total of 36 women to 44 men. A couple of men married a second time, and there were 2 single women who went out in 1820, but 36 women to 44 men. But letters from the women account for barely 3% of all the early missionary correspondence in the archives at Birmingham University. And the men's writings rarely mention wives and children beyond passing reference to illness, childbirth, and all too often death, with the occasional comment on a wife's role in teaching African women and girls. Likewise, professional historians in the 19th century were exclusively male, and this monopoly was not fully broken until the arrival of new disciplines such as feminism and postmodernism in the 1970s. Until then, the intertwined historiographies of mission and empire were highly ethnocentric and gendered. In other words, white men writing about other white men. One explanation for this silence around women is that prevailing meta-narratives traditionally dealt with political and economic transformations, inevitably led by male actors, while ignoring questions about cultural and social change, in which women figured equally with men. This focus on broad trends in the missionary movement persisted until the arrival of feminist history in the 1970s and associated forms of inquiry such as social history, life history, and oral history. Until then, if women were given any space at all, it was either confined to numerical observations, so many women in such and such mission station, or to discussion in dedicated chapters, thus obviating the need to incorporate the centrality of gender into the missionary narrative. As June Purvis pointed out 20 years ago, remaking history through a gender lens is fraught with difficulty, as it requires not only rereading the primary sources, but also developing a sensitivity to women's situation and gender power relations, which have been hidden or obscured in most secondary sources. So who was Susanna Klein? This is a silhouette of Susanna in the archives at Birmingham University, looking very demure. Portrait silhouettes were very popular before the invention of photography, but I actually never found any of the other women or men from these first 2 decades. So I like to think that it's revealing of Susanna's character It exists alongside one of her husband and the unmarried missionary who accompanied them, but maybe some others existed, but I never found them. So it's as if Susanna is drawing attention to the fact that she's making this noble sacrifice in traveling out to Africa to take Christianity to the heathen, and she doesn't want the CMS to forget about her. So who was she? She was the niece of the Reverend Thomas Scott, one of the Society's distinguished founders and an influential commentator on religion and social mores. She was brought up in relative poverty in Lincolnshire, and it was probably on a visit to her uncle in Buckinghamshire that she met a trainee missionary, Susanna Klein, from the state of Württemberg. You may know that the CMS failed to recruit any suitable, find any suitable British recruits until 1815. Until then, their recruits were Lutherans from the Germanic states of Europe. It was possibly to escape a life of drudgery looking after her bad-tempered widowed father that she decided at the late age of 43 to marry and travel to Africa. She would turn out to be a determined and outspoken woman with strong opinions, a sharp tongue and a quick temper. She also proved to be a shrewd manipulator, using her connection to her famous uncle with great adroitness when crisis loomed, which made it impossible for the CMS to ignore her. This family connection is crucial to her life story. There are 14 letters from Susanna in the archive spanning the period 1811 to 1823. They illustrate all too clearly why she was perceived by her male associates as a threat. They saw her as an inveterate troublemaker, but perhaps she was just an unusually forthright woman who was ahead of her time and whose offense was to disturb the comfort of the male status quo. Her first surviving letter reveals an unusually combative spirit and a willingness to intervene in mission affairs. It was written in response to an earlier reprimand from the CMS secretary, the Reverend Josiah Pratt, who had apparently found her criticism of the progress of the West African mission unfeminine. This earlier correspondence isn't in the archives, but I've reproduced a couple of paragraphs from her letter. I'm not going to read all the way through it, but you'll see she doesn't beat about the bush. She starts, "Reverend and dear sir, I'm very much obliged to you for your excellent letter. I trust that it will do me much good." She goes on to say we are all accountable to God. And then, however, I cannot think that even women ought to be indifferent to what is passing around them and what is going forwards in the church and in the world. Further on, she makes a suggestion, which is very pertinent to what will come later, that visitors should occasionally be sent out to the missionary stations to advise the missionaries and to report back home. And she finishes by saying the missionaries are often so circumstanced that they dare not write home many things which they wish to do. And even if they did venture to do it, they would probably be misunderstood and blamed for their observations. So it's as if she's saying, the men may lack the courage to articulate their concerns, but I don't. Right. Unfortunately for Susanna, within a year of her arrival in Africa, to her dismay, her husband had become an alcoholic, an all too common feature of European life in the tropics. It was clear, however, that she had no intention of accepting the cruel hand that fate had dealt her. Her husband was regularly criticized by the secretary for his poor progress in establishing a viable mission station. And I suspect that Susanna had a hand in crafting his more assertive responses, as they share the same suppressed anger, indignation, and manipulation that characterize her own. His, by contrast, were full of self-pity and much hand-wringing. Although Susanna was unusually confrontational, I don't think she was entirely unique. Her counterpart, Elizabeth Renner, whose life story is also told in my book, was another assertive woman who liked to get her own way. The fact that she was a black settler from America and a likely former slave makes her character all the more interesting. Then there's the tantalizing glimpse of another contemporary, Mary Ann Horton, who was said to have, like Susanna, a fiery temper, and according to the Freetown chaplain, a desire to be both master and mistress. It seems that the marital squabbles with her husband on the voyage to Africa had even led to blows. One has to wonder how many other feisty women have been lost to posterity just because of the absence of an epistolary trail. What was unique in Susanna's case, however, was the convergence of circumstances surrounding her intervention, without which it may never have happened. She was part of the CMS's first missionary enterprise before formal procedures and clear lines of authority had been put in place. Communications with London were very slow and unreliable, not helped by Napoleon's navy, which until 1815 preyed on British ships. And there were many, many shipwrecks, an unbelievable number. And so the missionaries were left largely to their own devices, all the more so because they'd made the unfortunate decision in 1808 to locate their first settlement outside the colony, in a remote area to the north, in what is now Guinea, where the slave trade was being pursued relentlessly, despite its abolition, of course, in 1807 by the British Parliament. The dysfunctional nature of the mission and its precarious situation generated much tension and ill feeling within the group, which spilled out into their correspondence. In the midst of this turbulence and discontent was Susanna. Once the expanding mission, like the colonial enterprise, acquired a more bureaucratic and hierarchical structure, women's voices were squeezed out and their room for agency constrained. Even as their numbers increased, hardening patriarchal views in Europe of women's place in society marginalized them further. It is this small window of not more than 2 decades, covering a largely unregulated and poorly documented period of early British missionary activity, that provides us with undisputable evidence of surprisingly high levels of female engagement on the CMS's first overseas mission. I'm just going to move this light. I'm afraid it's shining in my eye. Thank you. So what did Susanna do that so infuriated the CMS? It was, in fact, her decision in 1815 to turn whistleblower. The catalyst was the couple's forced departure from their second mission station after just a year, because their indigenous host had discovered that Jonathan was a drunkard, and so had declined to send the promised children to their school. It was probably to assuage her deep disappointment and divert attention away from the embarrassment of this second failure that Susanna wrote a letter to her famous uncle, in which she accused the missionaries of numerous misdemeanours. Her comments to the secretary in 1812, as we saw her suggestion of a visit, seemed to have fallen on deaf ears, and so she decided this time to approach her uncle. He was, however, elderly and no longer active in the society, and she must have known that he would pass her letter to the secretary, who could not this time avoid taking action. Sadly, this letter has not survived, but we have some idea of its content because one of the other missionaries in West Africa was asked to comment on the accusations without being told their source. From his detailed reply, we can gather that Susanna had accused one missionary, noticeably not her own husband, of drunkenness and another of profiteering. Also that the men quarreled in public, that one mission station was kept in an unruly state, and that there was, I quote, great personal licentiousness and profligacy. She even described the missionaries' houses as sinks of vice, a claim which rendered the missionary quite speechless. His name was Gustav Nylander, another German, of course. Josiah Pratt, the secretary, was appalled and alarmed. It was true that tales of missionary indiscretions had sometimes reached his ears, and that their letters were filled with tiresome complaints and accounts of petty feuds, but this was on a very different scale. His consternation must have been all the greater because the Reverend Scott had communicated the letter's contents to the Society's illustrious president, Lord Gambier, who was a much decorated admiral, and to one of its vice presidents, the famous abolitionist William Wilberforce, who even offered to come to London to discuss Mrs. Klein's claims. So they obviously all took her claim very seriously. A hasty decision was made to send the newly appointed deputy secretary, a man called Edward Bickersteth, to West Africa to investigate. His written instructions included interrogating Susanna as to the grounds of her claims and reprimanding her for her thoughtless action in writing to her elderly uncle, which had resulted in unwelcome attention elsewhere. it would appear that the CMS committee had already formed a negative opinion of her character. Most likely this was brought from visitors from Sierra Leone who quite regularly travelled to London. As she was to be told, and I quote, "Scarcely one with whom she has been connected in Africa who has not complained of her spirit, evident that she has not had the rule over it." Then there was also the grave offence of what they termed intermeddling with politics, which was of course a reference to her reprehensible behaviour in encroaching on the male domain of mission affairs. When Edward Bickersteth arrived in Sierra Leone in early 1816, he learnt that Susanna's name evoked a chorus of disapproval well beyond the missionary circle. Even the governor had heard of her temper. He did, however, get her to admit that she had spoken too strongly and acted without forethought. In his confidential report to the committee on his return to England 3 months later, he accepted her Christian sincerity, but blamed her tendency to judge too hastily and too harshly as the root of the distance, distrust, and separation that had afflicted the men. So in other words, it was a woman once again who was to blame for the situation. Nevertheless, he had to concede that despite her claims being exaggerated and in some respects ill-intended, they were not completely false. It's not surprising that the Society was anxious to ensure that no hint of Susanna's role in instigating its very first overseas inspection ever reached its benefactors, who were by now both numerous and unusually generous. It would have been unconscionable for an institution founded on conservative religious principles just 16 years earlier and closely aligned with the country's elite to admit publicly that it had been forced to take stock of itself by a woman. Whereas the committee was ready to acknowledge, even publicly, the poor caliber of the early recruits and their personal feuding, criticism from a woman was beyond the pale. A cover-up was inevitable. So I will then go on to say briefly how this was achieved and to look at some of the implications for this. So the next section I call, in my paper, I call historical amnesia. So the cover-up started, albeit involuntarily, even before Edward Bickersteth set off for Africa. When the secretary wrote to invite him to undertake the inspection, he could not bring himself to admit to someone introduced so recently to the Society's inner circle that a woman was the catalyst for the visit. So I've two short extracts from letters that Josiah Pratt wrote to Edward Bickersteth. They're reproduced in a biography of Bickersteth written by published by his son-in-law, T.R. Burks, in 1851. So in the first, again, I don't want to read everything, but Josiah Pratt refers to communications made to us, which will render a visit necessary. Accusations and insinuations are brought forward against some of the missionaries, he writes in his next letter. And then the Missionary Register, which you probably know was a widely read, popular monthly evangelical periodical, which Josiah Pratt established and edited, it gave extensive coverage to the visit, and it explained the purpose of it as being to examine into every part of its concerns there, obtain accurate information, apply a present remedy to any evils which might have arisen. So far, no clue as to who made the accusations and insinuations and which particular missionaries were being targeted. I have to admit that I don't know about letter writing conventions. Maybe some people in the audience do. It may be that it was considered polite not to make direct reference to individuals, not to name individuals. But what's important is that those that followed, who wrote histories of the CMS and so on, didn't probe any further. So others followed Pratt's lead with similarly vague statements, resorting to linguistic devices to avoid the issue of agency. And so I've got 3 examples here from 19th century sources. And they use the passive tense and the abstract noun to avoid the issue of agency. Burks, for example, talks about dissensions which had arisen, accusations have been sent home, which required a visit. The deputy secretary had striven with patience and gentleness, etc., to restore those who have fallen. The next is the first history of the missions in West Africa, actually, of the CMS missions, by the Reverend Samuel Walker, published in 1845. He talks about disunion unhappily existed among them. Dissensions had crept in. And finally, Eugène Stock, who wrote a 4-volume history of the CMS, was its official historian, published in 1899, referred to sickness and death, and worst of all, dissensions again arose among them. The visit was to set things in order generally. It corrected many evils. So, no mention of Susanna so far. One might have expected the more critical and self-reflective approach adopted to historical inquiry over the last half-century to have brought to light the fact that a woman was involved in instigating the inspection. Yet, despite the obvious clues, those historians who covered this episode seem to have accepted the CMS's version of events at face value. I know of 3 who have mentioned dissension, 3 historians who have mentioned dissension among the missionaries as one of the reasons for the visit, but none mention Susanna, even though her role in the affair is well documented in the archival records, which they had clearly consulted because their books cover the same documentation, draw on the same documentation as I did. So there are 3 here. The first, John Peterson, who was an African-American academic, wrote a history of Sierra Leone, much of which was devoted to the CMS mission. He talks of fear of unrest, increasing the tension among missionaries, which in turn led to almost incessant bickering, charges of drunkenness and profiteering, etc. There was one accusation of profiteering, in fact, against this missionary who's just mentioned in the next line, Leopold Butcher, in the correspondence. He was accused or suspected of selling the supplies that the CMS sent regularly from England, selling them at a high price and buying inferior replacements for the missionaries. Never really resolved. Drunkenness, I don't really recall at this early stage. If there were any mentions at all in the men's correspondence, it was very, very fleeting. Later on, this became quite a big issue. And then you will notice that Peterson states that Butcher suggested a visit from London to assess their work and to end the quarrelling. Well, of course, we've seen that Susanna suggested it first. Butcher's suggestion was in 1815. Susanna had already suggested a visitor in her letter to the Reverend Pratt, and she also repeated it in a letter to her uncle in 1814, but that has not been picked up. The second quotation comes from Stiv Jacobson, a Swedish. I think this was based on a PhD. He wrote a book about the links between the mission and the slave trade in West Africa and the West Indies. So he also talks about tensions between the missionaries, disunity, and then very tellingly, he says, this decision to send Bickersteth to West Africa is interesting as being the first of a long series of secretarial visitations in the CMS. And in fact, more widely, this visit from Bickersteth is seen as the starting point for the establishment of an Anglican mission in West Africa. And so you might have expected that there would be some a degree of scrutiny of the events leading up to the inspection and following it, but there were none. Yet there is no doubt that Susanna's letter to her uncle was the catalyst for the visit. There are numerous clues in the archive, in particular in the set of private instructions given to the deputy secretary on the eve of his departure. The latter starts with 2 general items. Firstly, he was to establish and deal with cases of open sin, meaning drunkenness, and worldliness, meaning profiteering. And secondly, to inquire into all the topics in Mrs. Klein's communication. One is therefore left to wonder even if historians ignored Susanna's letters in the loose folders of correspondence in the archive, in the mistaken belief that they contained just inconsequential women's talk. Why did they ignore the details of Edward Bickersteth's instructions or his confidential report and the minutes of several meetings? Unless we accept that the female voice simply did not register in their consciousness, we have to conclude that the suppression of Susanna's role was intentional. So let me just perhaps get rid of that. Susanna continued to create waves in missionary circles. For example, when she learned that the deputy secretary had put her husband on a 6-month probation for his sin of intoxication before leaving for Europe, she was incensed and wrote him a letter dripping with reproach and designed adroitly to prick his conscience. I have to say, he fired off a very tart reply to her. She was also instrumental in delaying Jonathan's dismissal in 1818. He was about to be dismissed, and then she managed to, don't have time to go into details, to arrange for him to be given a new posting. But then when the axe finally fell in 1820 and the couple were ordered to return to Europe, despite the situation appearing hopeless, she did not give up. Through a combination of ingenuity, appeals to numerous persons of influence through her husband's letters, and veiled threats in 2 letters of her own, she triumphed. Her husband was moved from the CMS payroll to the colonial governments, thus where he was made a school teacher and parson, thus enabling the couple to avoid the humiliation of a return to Europe in disgrace. Susanna died in her remote island home in 1825. He, amazingly, outlived her by 5 years. Several of Susanna's letters from these later years are instructive of her character and explain why the society felt so threatened by her. I don't really have much time, but there is one letter that is truly astonishing. She's just learned that her husband has been dismissed. He was summoned to Freetown, Sierra Leone, and in advance she had gathered testimonials from the island where they were living, part of the Ile de Los, which is about 40 miles to the north of Freetown. Captain Hagan was the British officer in charge of the troops there, and Mr. Garnsey was the second chaplain in Freetown. There were 2. So she is much surprised when her husband returns from Sierra Leone to find that the committee had proceeded against him as they had done. If they meant to reject the testimonials, why not inform us of it before? And if they, notwithstanding, thought it necessary to censure Mr. K, why involve me in his punishment by ordering me to return home? This is 1821. It's a fairly astonishing statement. And she then goes on, I wish, sir, to be informed on what ground and by what authority the committee have dismissed me. And she's very aggrieved. And her veiled threat comes when she says, I'm inclined to think that when these hard measures are duly weighed in England, they will bring more durable disgrace on those who formed them than on us. In the end, the acting governor in Freetown allowed them to stay. He was probably fearful of negative repercussions in England if Susanna followed through with her veiled threat. But this remarkable letter is testimony not just to Susanna's fortitude in a crisis, but also to her readiness to flout social convention, because of course it would be another 50 years before an Englishwoman was legally entitled to keep her own property and income. But here she was defiantly insisting that she be allowed to remain in Africa without a husband and to continue to receive a wife's salary. It was a very provocative statement. Right, I now will return to the topic of alternative facts. And I think it's important to distinguish between what I might call obfuscation, so being vague and economical with the truth, which is really what we saw in the earlier examples, and actually rewriting the narrative, because I found that this male struggle with female agency has spawned some troubling distortions in the historical accounts surrounding the first inspection of a CMS mission. I found it particularly disconcerting to discover that 2 historians in the past 50 years have attributed Susanna's unusually forceful actions to her husband, thus perpetuating the all-male story. So the first, oh, sorry, this was the second. I'll just give you, this was another letter that Susanna wrote to the Reverend Pratt a couple of months later, where she talks about how disgraceful it was, and if it wasn't for the governor, the indignity of many would not be restrained to private conversation and censure. So in other words, she's saying to the secretary, you know, I might well spill the beans and write some more unwelcome letters. So sorry, it's the next slide, rewriting the narrative. Here are a couple of few extracts. There was an incident in 1812 when some Fula warriors, that's Fulani, nomadic tribesmen from the north, invaded their area and burnt down some villages. And Jacobson writes, a missionary there fled in fear to Bashir with his pupils. Now, Jonathan Klein stayed put. It was Susanna who fled together with another missionary wife and a few girls. And they were much derided for that, you know, having been cowardly and so on. So that was a distortion. And then the incident where they had to leave because the tribal chief wouldn't send them any children. His name was Fernandez. This talks about the relations between Klein and Fernandez. He had been promised children, however, he never received any. So he left Bramia and went to the Ile de Los. Well, of course, it was the couple who did this. And then on the Ile de Los, he came into conflict with slave traders. When the missionary criticized it, the consequence was that he was not accepted anymore. It's actually well documented in a couple of letters that it was Susanna who criticized the traders, accusing them of engaging in smuggling and the slave trade. There's a very long letter that goes into details about that. But here it has been metamorphosed into a husband who's responsible. And by the turn of the year, he'd left the islands and gone to the coast. The other missionaries were very critical of him for this second removal. I mean, this book is written 50 years ago, so one does make some allowances. But what is very ironic is that in the 150 pages devoted to the mission in West Africa, he never mentions a woman once, not once, except in a footnote in which he references a letter from Sarah Hartwick, the first missionary wife, a letter in 1805. The second instance is provided by the American historian Bruce Musa, who I think died not that long ago. He doesn't ignore women entirely, but he rarely accords them any agency. He's written extensively, actually about the slave trade in West Africa a lot, but also about missionaries. And he's written extensively about one of the first two missionaries, CMS missionaries to travel to Africa, Peter Hartfink, who disgraced the society by turning to the slave trade. He was accompanied to Africa by his wife, Sarah. And so Musa is obliged to consider her presence in Hartwick's life, but he does so only insofar as it relates to her husband. And the examples that I want to show is that he, with his wife and research associate, Nancy Musa, they published transcripts of letters concerning Peter Hartwick, who lived for a short time with the Kleins in 1814. And this includes the transcript of a letter from a Freetown resident to the secretary, in which Mrs. Klein has become Mr. Klein. So you may not be able to see these very clearly, but where the red circle is, it actually says Mrs. Klein. Now, I was familiar with the transcript of this letter. And when I came to read the original, I was rather perplexed, and I asked one of the archivists at Birmingham what she thought it was, and she confirmed it was Mrs. Klein. Later on in the letter, this says the disagreement between her and Butcher. It's very definitely her. And here, not very clear, this is Mrs. K, and this has been this is Butcher and Mrs. K. The transcript reads, has, you can see in bold, Mr. Klein, him, and Mr. K. Now, the author of the letter, Kenneth McCauley, he actually goes into Mrs. Klein's dreadful behavior, in his opinion, in quite a lot of detail. So he's not hiding her. The point I'm making is that this is a sort of subconscious bias that has crept in because there's always the assumption that the protagonist is a man. So this should read without mentioning Mrs. Klein's name or giving him, that's Nylander, the least reason. And here, this is the real cause of the disagreement between him and Butcher should be her and Butcher. The greatest enmity exists between them. And here, it was proposed that they settle in one of the villages in the colony, but without effect, as both Butcher and Mrs. Klein were averse to it. So I'm now going to, there was just a further example of error I found was in the original cataloguing of the CMS documents. The original archivist has catalogued a letter as being written by Jonathan Klein, when it's actually in Susanna's handwriting and signed by her. So maybe, again, the archivist, it had a very defiant tone. Maybe the archivist just assumed it was written by a male hand. So we are left to wonder, were such lacunae intentional or a misreading of a hard to decipher handwriting, or indeed of a socially determined blind spot that precludes the association of women with anything outside the domestic domain? I'm now going to conclude, hopefully in a couple of minutes. So I think this is a sober illustration of the ease with which a female voice that dared encroach on the male prerogative could be suppressed. If we accept that Susanna was unusual but not unique, and that other women were probably silenced in similar ways, there are a number of lessons to be drawn from the above. The first is obvious, the importance of casting a sustained critical eye over the existing material and engaging in what has been referred to as reading against the grain for subtext and silences. And of course, the importance of going back to primary sources rather than relying on secondary sources, which is, of course, is what hard-pressed academics often have to do. The second, I think, is the importance of bringing individual women out of the shadows. This account of Susanna's life in Africa has exposed the blind spot that denies women a role as historical actors, whether openly or behind the scene. She was not just a woman who dared expose the darker side of missionary life, she was also a skillful manipulator of the men around her. Until such women were able to negotiate new spaces for themselves later in the century, they had to use whatever means available to maneuver their way around a world ruled by men. Her contemporary Elizabeth Renner was not as brazen as Susanna, but she certainly used the men around her to get what she wanted. We are left with the intriguing impression that the contours of mission life were at times shaped more by female personality than by the patriarchal order. Thirdly, if we multiply these instances of factual distortion and omission through an infinite combination of time, place, and circumstance, we come to the unsettling conclusion that ordinary women must have exercised a higher degree of agency in shaping a mission's future course than has hitherto been envisaged. Even if such women were the exception, now I'm talking about ordinary women, not pioneering women who have had biographies written about them and have diaries published and so on. Even if such ordinary women were the exception, the act of rendering all women invisible closes down the possibility of such recognition and allows the myth of the omnipresent male to be sustained. Fourthly, Susanna's life story raises the even more disturbing possibility that in some cases, women's actions and words have been attributed to men, whether deliberately or not. Of course, we're familiar with this in the world of science, in the male the disciplines associated with men, science, mathematics, medicine, etc. But this makes it all the more important to engage in the retrieval of women's life stories as advancing the quest for historical accuracy and reminding others that there is much to unlearn about our shared past. Finally, it's depressing to end on a negative note. The CMS was not alone in ignoring women as historical actors. Sadly, the gender bias is structural in the lack of an archival trace makes it impossible to do justice to the many women and indeed the many indigenous men and women who served on the early missions, because they were never considered legitimate subjects for either public readership or historical record. Despite the sustained efforts of feminist scholars in reconstructing the lives of missionary women, their role will continue to be downplayed or ignored, and mission history will continue to propagate alternative facts. Sorry, I've gone over by a few minutes. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much, Fiona. You could have had another 10. I'm sure we would just have been as spellbound as we were. Everyone was nodding heads in agreement with you. I'm quite sure that there are a number of terribly shocked people joining us. I have already received a couple of questions from Ann Summers.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm going to forego my chair's prerogative of setting the discussion going, because it's already going. If you would like to ask a question or give an observation, please do raise your hand by clicking on the reactions button, which is right next to the red end button. And you'll see that the first option there is raise hand. I see Debbie's already raised a hand. If you would like to ask a question and you somehow, for some reason, can't find that button, just wave a lot and we'll find you that way. So I'm going to, Fiona, if it's okay with you, I'm going to take two questions straight up, one from Ann Summers, and then I'll move to Debbie to take questions from her. Please unmute yourself.
Yes. Can I ask, and I'm ignorant about this, you mentioned a wife's salary. Can you say a little bit more about this?
Yes. Yes. Shall I take another question as well? Joe? Can't hear you.
Yes, sorry about that. Yes, please, let's hear from Debbie first, and then we can answer two questions together.
Did Anne not have two questions?
Oh, well, the other one was
She did.
She did. Just curiosity as to the name of the place in present-day Guinea. Where
yes, okay.
But that's just a personal curiosity.
Okay. Yeah.
Right.
And Debbie?
Okay. That was absolutely splendid, Fiona. It sort of reminded us why history is important and why
yes.
Going to, that there's actually plenty to be found in the documents, that
yes.
You just, that even the sort of what is regarded as a good early history of the CMS as a whole kind of just glides over this, is very striking. I'm struck by her age, that she's going at 43, and how does that feed into her greater confidence and assuredness? But what also intrigues me is why she fights so hard to stay in Africa. Does she not want to fail? Did she like Africa? Do you get much sense of her commitment to the people or her commitment to the work? Was she any good at being a missionary? Do you get much sense of her encounter with the locals? Is she good at evangelizing or teaching? Yeah, so those were the things that intrigued me.
Okay, thank you. The wife's salary, it's actually very interesting that the woman I briefly mentioned, the black missionary wife, Elizabeth Renner, I don't know how much you know about the origins of Sierra Leone, and the fact that when I said she was a settler, she had come from North America. Yes. With around about just under 1,200 former slaves who chose to go to this new colony that the British, the Clapham sect, had established in Sierra Leone. And Elizabeth Renner had been the missionaries' housekeeper in Freetown. And the early settler women had very independent lives. They would have been shocked at how constrained an English woman was at that time. So they all ran businesses, they earned their own money, they were just used to looking after themselves. It was very, very hard there, and people died. And so you just had to fall on your own devices. So there's this wonderful episode where Elizabeth Renner, now married to a man who is totally unable to manage the finances of the mission. And she'd obviously brought a bit of money to the marriage and he had spent it. So she starts insisting that the £50, a missionary at that time got £100 a year. And then there was £50 for a wife, which was considered an allowance, i.e. an allowance that went to the husband, and children, I think it was £5 for a child. So Elizabeth Renner was not having this. She was insisting that this £50 was hers to do what she liked with. And her husband was terribly embarrassed by this, but actually the CMS accepted it. And after that, this was in about 1815, I think, after that, they always referred to this allowance as the wife's salary.
Thank
you. It was £50.
Wow.
The area where they established the first mission was in the Rio Pongus. There's a river that runs up through Guinea called the Pongus River. And it was much favored by slave traders because they could take their ships up this very wide river out of sight. Because of course, from 1808, the British Navy was capturing slave ships along the coast. And their first settlement was called Bashir, B-A-S-H-I-A, and they set up another one called Kakara, and it was all pretty disastrous actually. And in the end, the slave traders, of course, didn't like them there, and encouraged the local people to be hostile, and the missions experienced a lot of arson attacks. And in 1818, they finally left. And they moved within the borders of the colony. And by that time, there were lots and lots of freed slaves coming off the slave ships being captured by the British Navy. And all these villages were springing up. And that's when the mission became a bit more structured. So Susanna really lived on it at a time when she could do some of the dreadful things she did. So to come on to Debbie's question, I'm afraid to say she was hopeless. And her husband was too. He was an alcoholic, and they actually moved mission station about 5 times. And when Bickersteth went out there, he compiled a list of how many adults they had baptized on each mission station. There were about 5 stations by this time, 4 or 5. And how many children baptized, how many marriages, how many Christian burials and so on. And Jonathan Klein did appallingly badly. And Susanna really wasn't very interested. And the men thought she was very ambitious, that she wanted her husband made head of the mission. Why was she so concerned not to go back to Europe? I think it was failure. And it's quite interesting that when her husband was going to be dismissed in 1818, Josiah Pratt had to write to her uncle, the Reverend Scott, and say, look, I have to warn you that we're about to dismiss him and they will have to come to Europe. And Scott writes a letter back saying it will break her heart to be sent back to Europe. So I think it was just these were early days. This Peter Hartwick had abandoned the mission and gone off to the slave trade. But apart from that, nobody had been sent back. The idea of returning to Europe was just unacceptable to her. I don't think she liked it. She wrote a very long letter to the secretary's wife, Elizabeth Pratt, at one stage, saying how dreadful it was and the servants were no good, and that European missionaries should be allowed to bring a servant from Europe with them. No, I'm afraid a great disappointment.
Thank you so much, Fiona.
Yes, thank you.
And her age, I don't know, you know, maybe she was very well established. I know that her father, who was Reverend Scott's brother, they had fallen out, and the father, I don't know whether it was drink or gambling or whatever, but he got into all sorts of trouble. And her mother died when she was 21. And she had at least one older sister, but if the sister had married, she would have been running the household.
So
So maybe this was just an
anything to
escape.
She had nothing to go back to.
No.
So for all its disadvantages, she wanted to stay in Africa, even though the husband is hopeless. And
yes, yes.
Any other questions? I see one from Jack. Oh, Rosemary, is that a question or are you clapping?
Oh, well, no.
Sorry, my confusion.
No, I have a question.
Okay, in that case, I'm going to take 3 questions. One from Rosemary, one from Jan, and one is that you. Gwyl, did you want to ask a question or are you clapping? Okay, 3 questions, Rosemary, Jan, and Gwyl.
Thank you very much, Fiona. Fascinating paper. Again, I'd like to come back to the beginning of your story and wondered about the policy of the CMS. Did they in any sense act as a sort of marriage bureau, in that you had several women who wanted to go out as missionaries and were sort of introduced to male candidates? Was that the sort of thing that was going on at that time? And I also wondered about the unsatisfactory nature of some of those early missionaries, and whether language, cultural differences between German Lutherans might have been problematic for them in some way, and whether that might have been a weakness for which Susanna also sort of overcompensated. That was the sort of questioning in my mind.
Yes, okay, yeah, interesting. Shall I take the next one?
Yeah, Jan, would you like to ask your question?
Yes, thank you. I found that fascinating because my own area is actually Southeast Asia, and particularly Malaya and Singapore. I was comparing what you were saying, the situation there, where some of the missionaries who went out, male and female, would learn really difficult languages such as Chinese dialects and so forth. So I was wondering about 2 things. One is about learning West African languages, and if you're going to be a missionary, presumably to be successful, that's what you've got to do. Or are these freed slaves coming from America all speaking English? So what's the situation there in terms of communication and so on? And the second one, in relation to source materials and so forth, wouldn't an awful lot of the any written document for what was the usual thing in the tropics, you know, with insects and heat and floods and so on and so forth. So could it be that some of the actually got lost in West Africa and never made it back to the CMS archives?
Oh, yes, yes. Yeah. Okay, shall I answer those 2?
Hold on, let's just hear from Gwyl as well. Gwyl, don't forget to unmute yourself if you would like to speak.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, look, I've got a comment and a question. I hope that's okay. The comment is that I've been looking into the missionary work of an early CMS missionary to New Zealand, whose stock managed to obliterate his name from the records in a similar way to what you've described, by using the passive tense.
Yes.
And he obliterated it by saying he was a printer. He printed. He was the foremost, most active printer in New Zealand at that time for CMS. And Stock would say, oh, thousands of pages of the Bible were printed, blah, 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 without naming the person. And at one point, he even got to the stage of saying the printing press was busy producing more copies of the Bible, rather than saying who it was that actually was operating the printing press, which was this person that he wanted to eliminate all record from. So he's got sort of form, I think, in that respect. But my question was, did when she went out, when she went out with Mr. K, was she described in the records of the CMS as a missionary, or was she just referred to as a missionary's wife? And if so, was she paid the £50? And I think you mentioned at one point that there were 2 women who went out independently as missionaries.
Yes.
And were they described as missionaries and paid the £100? And was it assumed that any wife of a missionary who went out would sort of not be referred to as a missionary, but would sort of help with the missionary work, kind of thing?
Okay, thank you. Right. Yeah, did the CMS manage run a marriage bureau? I don't think it was as organized as with some of the other mission societies. Was it the NMS or one of them?
Moravians, I think.
Or the Moravians, that's right, yes. This Leopold Butcher, that missionary, went out as a single man, and he decided that he would like to have a wife, and he did write to the CMS in London, to the secretary, saying, can you find me a suitable wife? They didn't have much success, but he went back to England to report on the mission in about 1811, 1812, and found himself a wife then. It's true that most of the missionaries traveled out with wives, and they tended to be married not long before they left, in one case on the morning itself. And I've been able to trace most of their marriage details. I don't know how proactive the CMS was in helping them with that, actually. I didn't come across any relevant documentation, but it may well be that that was the case. In fact, if you read the book, it was a complete haphazard event that their inaugural voyage had a woman on it, because Peter Hartwig and Melchior Renner were recruited as single men and spent some time in Clapham learning English and learning about the Anglican Church and so on. And he suddenly announced, just before they were due to travel to Africa, that he was getting married to the governess in one of the Clapham sect households, in the Reverend Ven's household. And I think Josiah Pratt, to give him his due, he thought, oh, this is an excellent opportunity to showcase the Christian family, the nuclear family. And I think they did then encourage the men to marry. And even though the death rate was dreadful, both men and women, they seem not to have wavered in that. And that's why so many of the missionaries took women with them. And then there were 4 who married African women. 2 were settler women and 2 were mixed race, the daughters of slave traders with African women. The question of being Lutherans, I've actually noticed that other people have written about this, but it's not really something, I'm afraid, that I spent much time on. I think the CMS had enormous difficulties getting any recruits at all. And they failed for 2 or 3 years. And then they had the offer of these men from the Berlin seminary. Peter Hartwick, who turned out to be a bad lot, was rumored to have only joined the seminary to avoid being conscripted into the Prussian army. But they were of poor quality, but of course they didn't have any training. Their English was not bad, or certainly after a few years, their English was reasonable. And some of them, they were allowed to write their journals and reports in German to begin with, and then they were translated in London. And they varied in how quickly they shifted to English. I'm sure there were cultural factors, but life was extremely difficult. It took them 4 years to establish their first settlement. And I'm ashamed to say I can't remember the name of the speaker at one of these previous events who was talking about the mission in Liberia. Joe, you'll remember.
Oh, one of the boy, the young man.
Yes. Anyway, I mean, you know, I asked a question about schooling, and he made the point that Sierra Leone was so much better organized than Liberia, but Sierra Leone as well. I mean, you know, at times there was starvation in Freetown because Britain was at war with France, and supplies didn't get through, and they didn't have any guidance. All the mission societies were new, really, so they didn't have any examples to follow, and they did their own thing, and life was very difficult. They spent an enormous amount of time just getting supplies. Once they started taking children in, just finding rice and basic foodstuffs was difficult. So I'm sure there were cultural differences, and probably language was a problem. Coming on to the next question from Jan, what was rather unique about their situation, because they decided to establish the first mission in the midst of a slave trading area, their first children they took in were the children of slave traders. And there were two conditions attached to this. The first was that the children had to be taught in English, because the slave traders wanted these mixed race children they had to become, what's the word, sort of a part of their business, and to bridge the gap between the cultures. And they thought that it was to their advantage in trade and so on. So they insisted that the children were taught in English. They also insisted that their children should not do manual labor, because of course in the home they had slaves to do it. So that was, and in fact in this first mission that Elizabeth Renner was running, there were child slaves, which is a bit astonishing. There was only one of these missionaries, Nylander, who actually learned the language where he was to any degree, and he kept submitting lists of dictionary items and so on, and translations to London. I don't think the others bothered very much. And of course, one advantage of marrying a settler woman was that she was much more likely, or a mixed race person, they were much more likely to speak a local language because they had been brought up there. Source materials, yes, a lot of stuff was lost, because actually during the war against France, and even afterwards, a lot of the ships, when they left Sierra Leone, they traveled via the Americas, because the trade winds took them that way. And during the war, it was safer. It avoided privateers catching them. And so letters were lost. But the CMS, I think, was better provisioned than other mission societies. They started quite a good system. From 1820, every letter that left London or arrived was copied into mission books. But stuff was, there's a whole period, about a year, when there were only 2 letters from the missionaries. So there would have been other stuff. It was frustrating sometimes not to be able to follow through on threads. Yes, Susanna Klein was not a missionary, she was a missionary wife. Until the 2 women who were sent out in 1820 were missionaries in their own right, and they got a salary. I actually can't remember whether it was £50 or more. But until then, missionary was a male noun, and it was a missionary wife. And although the CMS appreciated the role they played in keeping the mission going on the domestic front and teaching African women and children, they didn't communicate very much with the women. It was all through the men. And it wasn't really till the 1840s, there was quite a feisty woman called Julia Sass, I think, in the late 1840s, 1850s, who became headmistress of the first secondary school in Freetown, who wrote quite, strong letters to London and so on. But up until then, there was very little communication with the women, which is why these 3 women I talk about in my book are exceptional.
So Julia Sass, we heard about some years back from Zilke Strickroth.
Oh yes, that's right.
In the early schools. And I did in fact send Silke the info, but because I think she's still in London, but we've not heard back from her.
Have I answered everything so far? Hopefully.
Yeah, I think so. I do think so. Are there any other questions? Anybody else would like to ask something? We're down. Oh yes, Ann Cottrell would like to ask. Jan, is that a new hand as well?
Yes.
Okay, so Anne first, then Jan. So
I was wondering whether there were children, missionary children involved, because in the Gold Coast, sometimes the children were sent home because the climate in West Africa was so difficult and the death rate high. And sometimes the mothers went as well in that case. So I don't know whether there was this problem of what to do and how to split the family in Sierra Leone.
Okay. And shall I take the other one, Jan?
Jan, yeah, Jan.
I was just thinking, you mentioned the 1840s, and I was thinking that again in Malaya, things start to develop when the Catholics come in and the American Methodist missionaries. So I was just wondering what actually happens after the 1840s, and does what Susanna has done actually have any effect on the later development of that particular CMS mission?
Okay, thank you. There were very few children of the missionaries. A number of the wives died in childbirth, and usually the baby was either born dead or died soon after. Of course, there was a huge amount of infection there. There were a couple of children who were sent to England quite young. One died soon afterwards, and there was this Leopold Butcher sent his daughter. There may have been others. The settler wives did have children. In fact, Nylander, who was the missionary who was asked to comment on Susanna Klein's claims, went out in about 1809, I think, and he married a settler woman, and they had quite a few children, most of whom died. But when both parents were dead, the two surviving daughters were sent back to England and went to clergy school, the clergy's daughter's school. Is that what it was called in Yorkshire? The one that the Brontes, based on the one the Brontes went to. It was called, anyway, sorry, they went there, and then they went back to Sierra Leone as missionaries in their own right in the 1830s. And so they were mixed race, and they were, I think, I don't know what age they were when they went to England. I think they spent 7 years in England. They both returned to Sierra Leone as missionaries in their own rights, and both married within a couple of years. One married an African-American missionary, and the other a white missionary. They both died in childbirth, but one had a daughter who survived, who became a missionary in Ceylon or somewhere. I'm sorry, I can't remember the name. What is interesting in their case, which ties up a bit with the question from Jan about the 1840s, they were not very well received. There were two single women sent in 1820, and they were allowed to go because one was accompanying her brother. And this one single woman died after 9 months, and the other married a missionary. And of course, there was this discussion around sending out single women, because if they got married, then that was a sort of waste of recruiting them as a missionary in their own right. After that, they didn't. The CMS didn't send any women to West Africa. I know they sent women to India and other places, but not to West Africa until these two daughters of mixed race daughters of Nylander went out there. And they weren't very well received. Now, I didn't, Silkies knew a lot more about that. I'm not sure whether it was race that, was against them, or whether it was the fact they were single women. And I also suspect they were both rather troubled. One of them married a famous missionary called Schon, S-C-H-O-N. He became quite a linguist. Anyway, he wrote incredibly emotional letters to the secretary because his wife, one of the Nylander daughters, had had a baby and was convinced that the nurse had swapped the baby. The baby wasn't dark enough, or was too, I mean, gosh, talking about royal families and babies, what color they are. She was convinced that her baby had been swapped. The baby was either too pale or too dark. And she was clearly suffering from postnatal depression. Anyway.
There is a novel in this, Fiona.
Yes,
there's a book in this.
there is. But what I wanted to also say is Elizabeth Renner, who married the missionary Renner in 1808, she was appreciated by the CMS. The secretary would told Edward Bickersteth, praise her, we really appreciate her. She, she's doing a wonderful job. But then when Renner died in 1821, she was completely sidelined and really treated very badly. And that was really because racism was creeping in at that stage, very early, 1820s, with a more structured missionary community in West Africa, and more missionaries, all of them British by this time, and looking down on the early German ones, and bringing their own wives. And poor Elizabeth Renner wrote 2 letters to the secretary, and was very aggrieved because she was badly treated. So racism was obviously a theme. By the 1840s, I don't know, there were quite a lot of African men and women who worked as assistants and lay persons and so on. But I didn't really go beyond the 30s.
Oh, okay, thank you.
John Young, would you like to ask your question?
Yes, thank you. Oh, thank you very much for that. I spent most of the afternoon watching a presentation about women in astronomy, and a lot of themes echoed in that.
Yes.
But here, I was wondering if you have a very assertive, feisty woman there, and her husband is German with English as a second language. Would you recognize any of her voice in his correspondence? If she maybe helped to tidy it up a bit, possibly.
Yes, as I think I said that I got the impression that some of his letters showed evidence of her hand because they were much more assertive than his. Language-wise, I think his language was pretty good, actually. He spent quite a long time in Buckinghamshire. Reverend Thomas Scott took on the job of training the recruits for a few years before they went out to Africa. I have a feeling he spent at least 2 years in Buckinghamshire, and maybe longer, and his English was not bad. But the role of the German language in the difficulties, I really can't say. And actually, I didn't pick up on whether Susanna Klein had an influence on later missionaries. I think that probably nobody really wanted to talk about her or him. I mean, it was a fluke that they were able to stay. And the last 10 years, I don't think he did anything at all, and she didn't do much. And they were supposed to be preparing vocabularies of the local language. Of course, there were numerous languages. And I only found one thing sent to London. I mean, they were full of hot air, I'm afraid, the couple. And so I suspect that they were conveniently forgotten. But But I'm sure she had a hand. And you see, when in about 16 or so, he actually stopped writing letters. He became very depressed. You know, Bickersteth put him on a 6-month probation, and he did manage to stop drinking for 6 months, but he then relapsed. And I think that kind of did it for him. And he wrote very few letters after that. And that's why she intervened. She intervened with the chaplain when he was dismissed and so on. She just kind of took over.
Can I ask just quickly, what was the drink? Was it spirits that they would have been drinking?
I think it was local rum and local palm wine, which could be incredibly intoxicating if it had fermented for a long time. And in fact, Klein went off. There was this issue around the fact that the only thing they were doing was teaching children, including the children of slave traders, and they weren't doing much evangelizing. They were supposed to be itinerant preachers and so on. And after Bickersteth's visit, some of them tried to go around the countryside, which was incredibly difficult, of course, the terrain and so on. But Jonathan Klein did actually go on a sort of 4 or 5 week trip. And at one stage, he was able to swap, cigarettes or something for palm wine. So he was quite happy that he was able to get some palm wine. Yes, but when they were living in Freetown, which the first missionaries did for 4 years, they got brandy and rum imported from America. And in fact, of course, with the triangular trade, rum would arrive from the West Indies to England and then go to Africa. But actually, at one stage, I think probably while the Napoleonic War was still going on, there were American ships that did the journey direct from North America to West Africa with goods to undercut. Tobacco and rum were goods that they brought into Sierra Leone directly, and trying to avoid customs duties and so on as well. There's a lot of smuggling going on. So I think they didn't have a problem getting hold of alcohol, unfortunately.
Yeah.
And they brought a lot with them. Jonathan Klein admitted that his supply he brought with him from England, he'd stashed in the bedroom, and unfortunately it soon got drunk.
It would have been safer than water anyway, wouldn't it?
Yeah, yes. And of course they used this Peruvian bark. Of course they suffered from malaria a lot, even though they didn't recognize its cause. And they would take this Peruvian bark, which is the basis of quinine. Quinine wasn't actually extracted commercially until the late 1820s, I think. So they would plead for Peruvian bark, and it was recommended that they add it to wine, not water. No, none of them wanted to drink any local water at all.
Right.
Understandable.
Yeah,
definitely.
Yeah.
It is now 6:59 p.m., which, as you know, is. I beg your pardon.
We've got something on. Oh, that's the link to Fiona's paper. Sorry.
It is the link
to on the chat.
Yes, if anybody wants it.
Yeah, it's the link to the paper.
You just click on it and it will open up behind your Zoom thing, so you can read it there.
But it will disappear.
I think a couple of people have already done it.
If anybody is stuck, they can just email me with their email address, and I can send it as well. FionaLeach@gmail.com is probably the easiest.
Fiona, there are a number of people who've had to leave, and they've asked me just to tell you thank you for a fascinating presentation. Sorry they had to go. Thank you very much. Very interesting. A number of people. So well done.
Okay.
Very interesting.
Thank you.
Is there anybody else who would still like to ask a question? I mean, yeah. I have approximately 42 questions for you. But
somebody here, Gwyl, wants to ask a question.
I think it's Gwyl.
Just got a quick one. Yeah, I think, I don't know if I missed what you said about this, but you've said that Bickerstaff's visit was the first of a series of visits. And I wondered if you could say a bit about how that played out and how many visits there were and over what period of time. And also, I think you said it coincided with the setting up of a missionary station. And I wonder if that meant that there hadn't been a missionary station prior to that, but the one was then set up. Something.
Sorry, well, maybe I didn't make it clear. I mean, my reading of it from reading various histories of the CMS was that until his visit, everything had been very dysfunctional and chaotic, and he laid down some rules and regulations. And one of the things he did was to establish a committee of missionaries in Freetown. And it was actually that committee that dismissed Jonathan Klein. It wasn't the committee in London. And so he introduced a range of measures to try and make the mission run more smoothly. But he, the first mission station was this one in what is now Guinea. And there were various ones that were created in the years after that, partly because Susanna Klein kept falling out with her neighbours and having to move. So they were outside the colony. The colony at that time of Sierra Leone was really just Freetown. And then it was the peninsula where these villages with names like Wilberforce and York and Kent and so on were established to take these slaves rescued off the slave ships. So there were these early mission stations, but from reading some of the literature looking at the broader sweep of the CMS historically, make the point that Edward Bickerstaff's visit established a firm footing for the mission, a permanent mission with a committee in Freetown and a set of rules. And before then, it was like the Wild West. It really was. They just did whatever they wanted. And in fact, in the very early days, because they were keen to get children to teach, they were paying slave traders to give them some children. Of course, in London, Pratt got onto this and said, "That's somebody said that's ridiculous. You're just creating, you know, a market for slave children." And so there were weird things going on. And it was only when that Rio Pongus mission in the north was closed and all the missionaries were clustered within the colony itself that it became a viable concern.
Right. Oh, no, thank you. And did Bickerstaff then make regular visits after his first?
I can't, no, I don't think so. I think
okay.
The point was made, this was the first CMS inspection visit.
Right.
And no doubt they went later to India and New Zealand and Ceylon and other places.
Yeah.
I don't know when somebody went back again to Sierra Leone.
Right, thank you. Yeah, okay.
Fiona, given what you've just said about how this kind of predicated other inspections, doesn't that mean that Susanna Klein's impact is that they started them and that this became sort of a, could you say that?
Yes, yes. I mean, part of the problem was, and it picks up on what I think Jan said, it could take months for letters to reach London and vice versa. And so poor old Josiah Pratt would issue instructions and reprimands, and they might take 2 or 3 months to reach Sierra Leone, by which time all the circumstances had changed, or they may not get there at all. So they always had an excuse, the missionaries, you know, they hadn't heard about the latest requirement and so on. So it was extremely difficult. And until steamships started, I think the first steamship that stopped there was 1830 something, 1835, 36. Communications were extremely difficult, especially for the missions out in the sticks. But yes, I guess it put in their heads the idea that you have to go out every now and then to see how people are getting on. And they didn't introduce home leave, which was after 6 years, until well into the 1820s, I think. I mean, it was really almost, it was a death sentence, actually. If you offered to travel out to West Africa, you weren't coming back. Butcher came back unusually because they wanted news of him, but he was the only one to do it for years and years.
think other missionary societies also found that the situation in the different localities necessitated a visit from the headquarters.
Yeah.
The LMS, for instance, sent a mission to the South Seas in 1820. I mean, a delegation had to go out. So there was, you know, local circumstances, as you were saying, are so difficult. And, you know, communication so difficult as well. So there was necessity to send delegations or secretarial visits or whatever they were called.
Yes. I guess also as the numbers of missionaries and families increased, there were more problems. And of course, there was this issue of interracial marriage that plagued them quite a bit. And in Sierra Leone, although they had welcomed these early mixed marriages, by the 1820s, they weren't in favor of that at all. There were the two mixed race daughters of a slave trader by the name of Hickson. They both married missionaries actually in Sierra Leone. But I don't know if they had children and what happened. But I think after that, it tended to be all white couples. There were a few, I think, there were a few scandals, I have to say, but as there were in the South Seas and South Africa and all over.
Yeah, there's sort of echoes of South Africa and the LMS in South Africa up to 1820.
Yeah.
I mean, I think this is a fascinatingly fluid period, you know, with, where things are in flux and, as you say, are unregulated.
And that's the time, that's the opportunity to find out about the women, unfortunately, became so much more difficult. So in Sierra Leone also, from the 1820s, all the mission reports from inside the colony, there were quite a lot of villages, sometimes staffed with very few missionaries, sometimes with quite a lot. But the head missionary or the chaplain in Freetown took all the reports, quarterly reports from the different mission stations and put them together and sent it to London. So a woman's voice disappeared. Whereas in the early days, I mean, Elizabeth Renner sent there's a surviving school report from her. But on the whole, there were a few, there was a chaplain's wife who was quite proactive, but on the whole, their voices disappeared.
Fiona, can I ask one question?
Sure.
Are you considering writing a broader history of the mission activity in this period, in this time, place?
A broader
because
history of what?
You seem to have of the mission stations that in this time, because you do have a very broad knowledge of a lot of detail.
As you know, I retired from academia a long time ago, but I decided in the first lockdown I'd write an article, and I was, of course, inspired by this alternative facts thing. So I wrote that during the first lockdown. It's taken all this time to get it published, of course. And I intended in this latest lockdown to write an account of Elizabeth Renner's life, because that is very interesting, because she goes from being appreciated by the CMS to being vilified in the space of 15 years. And there are other women
as well. Don't they owe her money?
Did they owe her money?
Didn't you say in the book that after she died, after her husband died, there's money that they're supposed to give her from the mission that never gets returned? Or am I wrong?
No, her salary dropped. This £50 she got as a missionary wife dropped to £10 and even £5. She got demoted from a schoolmistress to assistant.
Oh dear. Along
with the other settler wife. There was another one. No, there was the business of the house. No. I mean, her life was fascinating, and she got what she wanted through her husband. She did it much more subtly than Susanna. But once her husband died, as a black woman, she was exposed, and they pushed her out. As a widow, she was entitled, CMS rules were that a widowed wife was allowed to stay in the station where the couple had been, but she was driven out because another missionary who had recently remarried wanted the girls' school for his wife. And so that's what I intend to do. Now, I don't think I can cope with broader perspectives, but I will focus on Elizabeth Renner and this whole issue of race. And
someone else has got to do the girls who go to the Bronte school, please.
Yes.
You'll do it, Joy.
They wrote a few letters back once they were in Sierra Leone saying how much they'd appreciated various people, but thinking...
Lowood, was it called Lowood?
That was the Bronte school, but it was based on this, it's clergy, I'm sure it was clergy...
The one at Cowan Bridge?
Yes, Clergyman's Daughter's School, I think it was called. And was it Charlotte Bronte based the Lowood School on that school. And of course, three of them got TB or what did they get and died? Consumption there. I can't believe that these daughters who'd been brought up in the tropical climate enjoyed being stuck in a freezing cold school in Yorkshire.
Yeah, horrid. Damp too.
And they were in England 7 years, yeah.
I did do a bit of research, and Silky also did. Yeah, maybe. Let's hope we don't get another lockdown.
Or let's hope we do. But let me say that it's almost dinner time. It's nearly 7:15, and it is with grave misgivings that I would like to propose that we end the session.
Thanks, Jo.
Because we could definitely go on for hours. But let me say that I think it is fittingly forthright Women's Presence that we close this Women's Month, Women's History Month, open this Women's History Month as well session. Thank you so much, Fiona, for a wonderful paper and a wonderful presentation, and your masterful usage of the screen off.
Had to practice. Screening. To reveal a secret, really, Jo and I had an earlier discussion about how to manage it this morning. Anyway, thank you, Jo, for your help. It's
wonderful.
Sharing it, and thank you. I enjoyed it tremendously. Thanks a lot.